it was like a window opening. It was like, oh, I could get out of Austin, I could go to the peace camp, and I could start a new life. Because I knew I needed to leave Austin, because this was the woman I came out with. She kind of owned Austin. She'd been there many, many years, and it was like that town. It's a big town, but it was too big, not big enough for the two of us. So I needed to get out, and so that gave me a place to go. And so I actually got to the peace camp about 3 or 4 days before it opened, and so I was there for that process, the last process of the opening of the camp, and then I was there on opening day, and I was there off and on the whole first summer, and then I was there the whole summer in '84 because I was program co-coordinator the second summer. And then I was there off and on after that, mostly just for meetings. Well, my first experience with being there was I had been in a women's collective in Austin, so I'd been introduced to the idea of consensus, but it was a more or less of a group that existed and learned, we all kind of knew each other. Consensus at the peace camp was a very different thing because it involved whoever happened to be there that day. Well, the 3 days that I was there before the camp opened, the population of the camp doubled every day. And there was a major issue of concern, which was this guy in the town had, quote unquote, donated an American flag to the camp. And there was a big issue about whether or not it was going to be accepted. And so one day it was decided it was not going to be accepted. Then the next day a bunch more people came, raised the issue again, and so anyway, for several days it kept going back and forth about whether we should accept the flag. The main argument against accepting it was this was an international camp. However, we were opening on the 4th of July in 1983. So then finally it was threatening to kind of derail all of the preparations that needed to be happened. At this point, the day before, there were like about 500 women there at that point trying to do consensus on this. And we needed to build walkways, they needed to finish the privies, they needed to do a bunch of other things that were not going to get done. Oh, the kitchen needed to be built. A lot of other things needed to be done besides sitting around all day and talking about this flag issue. And so the leaders or somebody suggested that we do a process, and we divided into 3 groups. The people who were in favor of accepting the flags, the people who were against it, and the people who felt they could be some kind of mediators. They thought the issue was important, but that it needed to be mediated or resolved in some positive way. Well, I was in that 3rd group, and each of those groups then chose 5 women to represent them. And I was one of the 5 women chosen. So the 15 of us then sat under some tree, some big tree. It probably was that black walnut tree out in the field. And we spent about the next, I think it was 16 or 17 hours in a consensus process. As a result, I did not build any walkways. I did not build the kitchen. I talked and listened. And it looked pretty hopeless, actually, because the arguments were very strong on both sides. And but I knew it was very important because I knew that it was something the media was going to make a lot out of, and that had been part of my business in the past, was media. And that was why I had thought it was so important. And anyway, finally, we actually did come up with a resolution, which was that every woman would create her own flag, and that if anyone wanted to put an American flag, we would not accept that particular flag, but if any woman wanted to put an American flag on her flag, then that was fine. That was her expression. And we then went running out there was nothing open, I think it was a Sunday, and we went to yard sales. And we bought sheets, and we bought a lot of materials, and we bought things to decorate. the flags with, and I downstairs I found this wonderful cloth. It was like something from the 70s or even earlier, that was some kind of polyester knit, but it was covered with peace symbols. And so we cut those in strips, and a lot of women put these peace symbols on their flags. So then the whole next day or so, women were making flags. And the whole front yard of the camp these flags were hanging all over the front of the camp. They were hanging all around the camp. And that actually became the story, was the flags. That was part of the story that got reported by CBS, and there was a reporter there from CBS that came the next day, a woman. She was the only CBS was the only TV station that actually had a woman reporter, so she was the only one who got to go in the back. Other reporters were in the front, and Margot Adler was also there, and Margot I had previously met. And so Margot and this other woman whose name, Chris, I think her name was, Margot would remember her name. And I went out afterwards or something. I think Margot was staying Margot Adler was with NPR. And she was staying at the motel I guess it was in Seneca Falls or in Geneva. Holiday Inn, I think it was. And I actually went and stayed with Margot that night, and because we went out with this woman reporter, and she said that if we had not found a peaceful resolution of this issue, that would have been the lead story, would have been all about this guy trying to donate the flag and us refusing to take it. So I was just so gratified that I'd stuck it out through that long process, because I think it was really worth it.
When you said donated, you went in quotes. Why did you?
Oh, I think it was like a preemptive bid in bridge, which I don't even play anymore. But it was done in such a way that, I'm going to put you on the spot. Let's test out what these. And that was my feeling, was that it wasn't just he wasn't bringing milk and cookies. He was bringing an American flag, because he was going to test out whether we were, Americans or patriotic, whatever, or if we were communists or agitators or whatever. So I did a lot of different things that summer. I mean, I was involved in a lot of different aspects of things, but I didn't have a paid job. But one of the things I did that first summer was there were lots of people taking pictures. So like we mentioned when we were talking earlier about the Boston Women's Video Collective, but in addition to taking videos, they also took a lot of still pictures. And Jeb was there taking pictures, and Catherine Allport. And so I don't know how the idea came about that we should do some kind of a slideshow to go around and promote the Peace Camp off-site. But I volunteered. That's something I had done in the past, was make slideshows. So, and Ellen Schub. So I had made slideshows in the past, not with pictures I took, but using other people's pictures. So that's what I did. I put a slideshow together about the Peace Camp, using pictures from a whole bunch of different women. And then I took that around. Part of the time when I wasn't there, I was taking that slideshow around and showing it in different places. I actually went to WGBH. I think it was GBH. It's either GBH or BUR. And who was the woman? Some woman who was on the radio there. We went in the sound studio and I recorded the tape. I think pretty much I wrote it. There probably were other people that helped. I'm sure there were. There were lots of people who contributed to the idea, but I probably had to do most of it myself. I got lots of ideas from a lot of people. It's hard to remember exactly. Well, there may have still been some contention, but everyone that was in that process agreed to it. And there were some really, really strong feelings. And I guess I particularly remember a woman who was Jewish who had relatives who'd been in the Holocaust, and just, there was a lot of real negative stuff about the U.S. government and how the flag was a symbol of oppression, and there were, when we started, we mostly everybody went around and had their chance to talk, and then I don't really remember exactly how the process was managed. There may have been a 16th person there who was facilitating. I'm not sure. I don't even know if there's a list of who was in that process. But I know that there were some moments when, particularly when this woman was talking about the Holocaust, that I just felt like there's no way. There's no way we can do this. And then other women who were equally positive that if we did not, in some way, accept the flag, that we would be, we would just so damage any possibility of relationship with the town, and that we would just be seen as a fringe group and so totally and in such a totally negative light that it would undermine any effectiveness that we might have in terms of our larger mission. And I was, like I said, from the beginning, I thought what was important was that we come to some kind of consensus, and that we have, that we present some kind of unity in the way we were approaching things. Mm-hmm. So I don't remember where the idea came from about the diverse flags, but, it came out of, it's that thing that the Quakers say, that if you listen long enough and hard enough, a third way will appear, and it did. So to me, it's always been a magical process. And when people say that, you just can't solve things by consensus, I have to say, let me tell you a story. I've told this story over and over again so many times because it truly seemed miraculous to me that out of these people who were dead set, and when they started out, they were dead set against changing their view in any way. I felt really privileged to be part of the process.
Peace camp.
It was a major happening at the Peace Camp, and it sort of set a tone, I think, that meant that we weren't just some lockstep, you have to all believe the same, that we could actually attract a diverse community, and that we could somehow exist together. I think it's a model. It was a model, a hopeful model. Well, it's interesting because it was really after that summer that I decided to go to seminary and become a minister. One of the things that happened is that so many women of faith came, all different kinds, Catholic, Jewish, every kind of Christian, Buddhist, and pagan, of course, and there was just a huge, that was probably the most, in terms of groups of women that came, other than affinity groups that had formed around peace issues, the most common group that came were groups of women of faith, of one faith or another. And so I got, I met a lot of those women, and I saw how strong the faith communities were in this movement. I also, that summer, right before I came to the camp, I had been at my first Unitarian Universalist General Assembly. I had just recently become a Unitarian Universalist, and I had earlier in my life thought about becoming a minister back in the 60s when I was right out of college. I was a Presbyterian then, and I'd actually gone to seminary briefly and then decided that the Christian church was too narrow for me and I couldn't really do that, and besides, I didn't really want to be like one of the first women ministers and live in a glass house and that kind of thing. So I gave up the idea then. And so I'd only recently gotten back involved in a church, and that was Unitarian Universalist, and that was because I could go. Did that at the same time I came out I was welcome as a lesbian, and so it was beginning to occur to me that maybe now that I had a religion, I could actually become a minister. But it was really that summer, that first summer, that solidified it for me. So when I was there the second summer, I was actually already on my way to seminary. I'd been accepted, and I actually did my summer at the Peace Camp as field education in conjunction with the Rochester Peace and Justice Center, PJAC. It was a pretty gutsy thing for me to do, to go in and propose something like this as before I was even actually officially enrolled in seminary. But they let me get away with it, and it was really all about money, because that way I could get some work-study money that would help support me, because otherwise I didn't have a way to financially stay at the camp for the whole summer. So I got paid a little bit by the camp to be program director or co-coordinator, and then I also got the work-study money, so that those two pieces put together allowed me to afford to be at the camp all summer. Every week there were different groups of people coming, and there were different workshops and rituals, worship services, things like that. And we were kind of the interface between the people who wanted to come and who were willing to do a workshop, and then we printed up a schedule of workshops. Then mostly they were on the weekends, I guess. So every week we were scrounging around and figuring out what we were going to put together for a workshop schedule. And, sometimes people would write or call and say, I'm coming on such and such a time, I'd be willing to do a program on thus and so. So, and we tried to tried to have themes. I was co-coordinator with a woman who had various names. I think she was known as Sun some of the time. She was African American. Roz? Yeah, Roz, R-O-Z. Right. Yeah. And that was a very difficult, actually starting back the first summer, no, I guess it was the second summer, never mind, this really came up, but there were lots of concerns about the fact that the camp was primarily white, and women of color were encouraged to come and invited to come, but they weren't always comfortable coming. And upstate New York was not a particularly hospitable place for them. And so one of the solutions was to hire someone who was black to be on the staff, and that was Roz. And I was not, I always thought of myself as not being racist or anything like that. I had black friends all my life, but I never really understood about racism. And what I really had to come to terms with that second summer, and it came largely from working with Roz, was about how embedded we all are in a racist system. And I did a lot of unconscious things that she interpreted as correctly so as racist, because I just was so unaware. Like, I'd say, let's go to the local diner and have hamburgers, because I actually found out later that I was allergic to soy. So I had a lot of trouble with the food at the camp, because almost everything had soy in it, and I constantly had horrible cramps because of eating soy. So I was always I took every opportunity to get off-site and get a hamburger, because that was about the only other choice of anything to eat. And I'd very casually say to her, come on, let's go have our meeting up at the local diner. And I didn't realize, I was so unconscious that every time we went, people were staring at her. And it made her very uncomfortable. And there were lots of other, there's lots of other stories about all of this. I tried to get someone to come in to do some kind of awareness thing around race. Well, I got someone that was recommended by the local, probably Rochester YWCA, to come in, and the kind of training she did was awful. Even I thought it was awful, but Roz was totally upset. because it was some kind of thing that was like everybody has an ethnicity, and if you're white, say rah rah, you're white, and it wasn't anything about racism. It was pretty gross, and that just made things worse. And then the slideshow that I did, there were people who felt that it was racist because I actually went out of my way to show when there were black women there, I went out of my way to make sure those pictures were in the slideshow. And so there were complaints that, well, that was not really showing the true nature. It was showing it in a better light than it really was. And I even had some line in there about the issues, but it was not worded in a way that some people thought was appropriate. So before the end of the summer, Roz left, and she accused the camp and me personally of being racist. And I remember I cried for probably the next week, and I cried off and on for the next year about that. It was very upsetting to me, but it also sent me off to seminary with a commitment to try to understand racism. And it's actually affected the whole rest of my life. And I've since become an anti-racism trainer, and I've done a lot of work around this issue, both personally myself and with other people. And I'm actually currently now president of the local chapter of the NAACP. And that would have never happened without that experience. I would never be trusted with that. The fact that they wanted to elect me to this role, and that I have the backing of a lot of black people in this community, is a direct result of Roz having confronted me on this when I was at the Peace Camp. I wrote a longer story. The part that was in the magazine was one half, and the other part was actually published in a book which happens to be right here. The other half of the article, out of all my books here, the fact that it's right there is amazing. It's called Everyday Spiritual Practice, and mine was about anti-racism as spiritual practice. I submitted the full article to both, and this book chose to print the second half, and the article printed the first half. I really did not want to be arrested. The whole idea of it made me sick to my stomach. I'm slightly claustrophobic, and the whole idea of it it turned my stomach. And so I did not belong to an affinity group. I participated in all the rallies as just kind of a general supporter, but I did not actually belong to an affinity group.
Had you had like a musical background?
Well, I always like to sing. I actually sang a song in the opening ceremony. It was a wonderful picture of it, and it was taken by one of the women who was going to write a book, was going to do a photographic book. I forgot her name. She lived in Mannix. What was her name? Ruth.
Ruth Putter?
Ruth Putter, yes. That's a whole nother story. Well, anyway, she had taken this beautiful picture of me, and it was like a treasured picture. And I stored a bunch of stuff in Nancy Clover's basement, and it got wet. And I might still have this picture it was like in a folder, and so it's completely covered with this other paper because they stuck together. What I had been part of right before I came to the camp was a women's spirituality network called Our Lady's Mission in Austin that the woman I came out with, Margaret Nunley, and I formed. So I'd learned lots of chants, and I knew lots of chants before I came, and I liked to sing. Mm-hmm. So I was always out there around campfires singing and stuff like that, teaching songs probably. Margot and I taught a bunch of chants too. So that's how I knew Margot, because I was part of that women's spirituality kind of stuff. And I met Margot at a conference called Goddess Rising in California a couple years before the Peace Camp opened. Well, See, the slideshow. Okay, the slideshow, the idea of doing a book. Those are the kind of contributions that I was particularly interested in making, because I am a writer and somewhat of a documentary type of person. So I had started. I think it was the first summer. It was. I started collecting things the first summer. I'm pretty sure it was the first summer. And with the idea of putting some kind of a book together. And then Ruth Putter and this other woman, I've forgotten the other woman's name.
It was Bryna Fireside, Ruth Putter, there's two
Cataldo.
women's names. Mimi Cataldo.
Mimi Cataldo was the other person. And we were talking about they were around and they wanted to do a book too, so we thought it would be part writing and part pictures. And so it was during the winter, and it must have been, actually it had to be the winter of 83, 84, because otherwise I was in seminary after that. And I came a bunch of times during the winter to work on the book. And I stayed at Ruth's house. And Ruth lived in this amazingly beautiful house with an indoor swimming pool and a sauna. But and so I would go and stay at the Peace Camp, and then I would go and stay at Ruth's to work on this book. And there was like this complete disjuncture between the two. And I'm pretty naive. I go into everything thinking, that everybody's on the same page, that we're all sisters, that we're all, But the more I got into it, the more I felt like all these women, particularly Ruth, wanted to do was kind of rip the camp off. And then I found out they'd never actually spent the night there. That they just come, like you said, Mike said, they came and took pictures. Mm-hmm. And then they wanted to get famous getting their pictures out there. Well, I had spent a lot of time putting the writings together, and that's part of what I gave you the last time I was here, people's poetry. And, well, they wanted pictures in the book. They wanted a little bit of writing and mostly pictures. And I thought it was going to be a balance of pictures and writing. And then we were at, they did finally, so there was kind of this disjuncture, this growing kind of discomfort. And I was in the meantime, I would go away. And I mean, I remember there were some women that had this guest house on the Connecticut-New York border, or Connecticut-Massachusetts, New York border, called The Retreat. And they went away for a few days and they left me in charge. And I remember that what I was doing there was really focusing on the writing and trying to put the writing together. And I had ideas about the sections and how it should all be put together. And I had this whole thing kind of basically laid out, the book laid out, for the pictures then to be worked around the writing. Well, you can tell. They wanted writing worked around the pictures. I wanted pictures worked around the writing. Okay. So, and then I got whenever it was, I went back to Ruth's, and obviously we're not getting anything accomplished here because we're coming at this from two different. But the thing that really set me off was it was coming up on Passover. Well, I had been, way back before I went to the Peace Camp, I had often been a guest at Passovers. And I'm not an expert on Passovers, but Seder dinners. I mean, I'd been a guest I participated in a variety of Seder dinners. And I just got the idea. I said, wouldn't it really be, I asked Ruth, would you consider inviting the women from the Peace Camp? They would love to see your house. How about inviting the women here for a Seder dinner? I'll help you. I'll help cook, And that was when it became really clear to me that she was afraid of the women at the Peace Camp. She was afraid they would mess up her house, that they would be too dirty. In no way, shape, or form was she going to invite these women into her house. Somehow I was okay. But as a group, they were not acceptable. And I struggled with it all. In the middle of the night, I got up and left, and I never went back. I took all my files, and I just left. So whatever they did with that book, they found some other people to do writing, and they eventually did do the book. But I in good conscience could not stay after that. If my sisters were not welcome to a Seder of all things, then I couldn't stay there any longer. Much as I loved that swimming pool. One of my other major experiences there was with Sally Roche Wagner. And that would have been in the summer of '84 that she did this CD at the camp, dressed as Matilda Jocelyn Gage, and I was there. I remember the whole thing. That was such a great experience. And Sally and I have been friends ever since. And Sally actually became my mentor in terms of women's history. But then she actually, almost by happenstance, ended up renting a room in the house that had belonged to Matilda Jocelyn Gage. Eventually was able to buy the house, and they now have quite an amazing program going on there. They're renovating the house, and anyway, Ruth is on her board. I was pretty active in terms of trying to come to the regional meetings, right? We had the regional meetings, and I came to many of those, as many as I could, up until the point at which the camp itself was disbanded. I did participate in a number of those discussions. I didn't come to everyone, but I came to. I timed my, especially between '83 and '84. I timed my coming to. Usually there was a meeting of some sort going on. And I came to some after that, but then I was in seminary, and it got harder and harder to do that. But I did come to a few at least. And then after that, it was, probably years went by, but I always felt like I could go back there any time. And it really makes me so sad that we can't do that anymore. On the few opportunities when I had to go there, I would go. And but there weren't very many of those. I know I went in '98 because that's when we had our General Assembly in Rochester, and I actually brought a group of women to the camp. We were doing a little women's history tour, and I brought a group, and there were some wonderful women there that were singers, and they sang my T-shirt. I had the T-shirt on that has all these names of women, historical women, and they knew the song that went with that, and they sang my T-shirt. They were shining a bright flashlight on it so they could sing my T-shirt. Some woman in Minnesota, I think, wrote this song, so that was kind of a highlight. A couple times I went there, nobody was there. And I usually went in and wrote in the book and walked around and, walked up to, where the kitchen had been and walked. And then I remember one time I think when I was on sabbatical, I came and I went out and stayed with you out in the woods.
Didn't we go out to dinner?
Well, we probably went out to dinner. We went out and we walked a labyrinth. Well, we were basically told that it was our land forever. So I considered it one of my homes. And there was so much of it that was still there. Some of the paintings on the buildings were still there, and I would just, it was like a pilgrimage back to a very special place. So much happened there. And then I really did I wanted to write a book. I tried. I worked for a long time with Leanne Irwin. We had great plans to write a book, and I actually got a small fellowship from the Schlesinger to work on the materials, and I did some work on them, but they didn't end up giving me enough money for me to really do what I needed to do. Well, I was trying to get together I tried to get information from different people that Leanne and Cindy Sangre had actually written some pieces. She's the only one, as far as I could tell, that really did any writing. I wanted to function primarily as an editor, and I wanted to write a few stories and fill in some pieces, but we actually put quite a lot of work into it. And I spent several days in, looking at the archives, but I could tell that it was just it was a huge project to really go through those archives. Much bigger than I think I ever really imagined. At that point, we were talking about doing something, trying to get it out for the 20th anniversary. We were talking about trying to use it to kind of organize people to come back to the camp and really do, try to really get some energy going into the camp again, trying to raise some money. I mean, one of the problems was, how do you find all these people? But I actually made a flyer, and I didn't go to the march, but somebody took, I think maybe I sent it to Leanne, and a little quarter-page flyer thing to hand out to people, and I'd set up an email address, and I was hoping that word would get out and that women who had memories and things would, start sharing them. And that's when I think I interviewed Michelle at that point. She's a great resource, so.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, seeing myself as a potential religious leader, I certainly, that came to me. That was certainly just being with women who felt like they could really make a difference. That it really was. I mean, I think probably one of the most compelling arguments, and this was one of the pieces that I really, really wanted to have in the book, the first book. There was a woman who had written very powerfully about Nazi Germany and the people who knew it was wrong but didn't speak out, and that it was our responsibility, that we were the Nazis, our country was being the Nazis, and that we really needed to speak out. We really needed to have our voice be heard, and I had actually I was a German major in college, and one of the things that I struggled with a lot was trying to understand Nazi Germany and trying to understand especially how the church was co-opted in Nazi Germany, and so that they didn't, there were elements of the church that were that fought against it, but there were also the official church went along with it. And, how do you keep that from happening? And so I spent a lot of time studying that when I was in college. So that, that whole angle, that whole argument and perspective meant a lot to me about the importance of speaking out when you know something's wrong. And not just speaking out, but really strategizing about how to be effective in getting your voice heard. So, I mean, I remember, one of the things, it must have been from a regional meeting, because we wouldn't have done this during during the summer, but somebody did a whole bunch of Christmas carols, holiday songs. So there was, the dreidel song was in there too, so it wasn't just Christmas, but sort of anti-nuclear Christmas songs. And so I was in New York staying with Margot Adler, and I organized a caroling in some major place in New York City to sing Christmas carols of, the anti-nuclear carols. I remember doing that, and it was like, for me, that was like, I had this strong feeling that I really needed to do that, and I felt empowered to do it. I think without the experience of the camp, I would have never thought about, doing something like that. But there were 50 people who came out to sing these carols, and, I publicized it, all those kinds of things, and got a bunch of people out there to do it. So, well, and then driving around with this cruise missile on my van was quite an experience too, and it was especially weird because apparently, unbeknownst to me, there had been some kind of an attack This would have been 83. This would have been the summer of 83, toward the end of the summer, because we were on our way to the 20th anniversary of the March on Washington, the King with the great "I Have a Dream" speech. And then after that, I went to with the missile on my van to the Northeast Women's Musical Retreat, Northeast Women's Music, Numer, right? Yeah, and but I think I was by myself at that point, or I don't think my son was with me then. And I stopped someplace to, get gas or get a snack or something like that, and people were there'd been some missile attack of some sort, and I don't remember what it was. It would have been in August of 83, whatever that was, and people were really horrible to me about, how can you do that? It's so un-American, and and I didn't even know what had happened. I was sort of out of it as far as that was concerned. And then I actually let a bunch of people, and I totally don't even remember who these people were. This is the life we led those days. I let them take my van with the missile on it all the way to Florida while I stayed in Cambridge. This would have been right at the opening of the camp. And there were, like we had a lot of songs that we did and chants and things like that. But there were some women who did not like the chants. They thought it was too pagan-y or spiritual or something. And I remember particularly this one young woman who was spirituality has nothing to do with politics. And they don't have anything to do with each other. They should be kept separate. And she was adamant about this. And so I went running to Margot, and I said, we got to do something about this. So we put up that we would do a workshop on politics and spirituality. And so we had this circle of women sitting on the ground, and this woman, we made sure this woman came. We said, you caused us to have this workshop, so we're going to have this workshop. But so we're talking about how important it is to have a spiritual element in our political work, because it really keeps us going, and it really strengthens us for the work. And we're saying, like, we sing these songs when we're going on an action, when we're marching, and it's really important for keeping the spirits up. We talked about the civil rights movement and how important songs were in the civil rights movement and in demonstrations and all this kind of thing. Well, this woman then just she began to loosen up just a little bit, and then she said, all right, prove it to me. Let's just go down to the gate. So we all marched down to the gate, and we were singing that song that became Stronger Than Before, but it didn't start out stronger than before. The chant I had learned, we are the old women, we are the new women, we are the same women, and the original thing was either wiser or deeper than before. And on the way to the gate, it became stronger. People may have sung Stronger before, because it was a zipper song that you could insert, you could insert any words into. But the common words, if you saw it printed, it was deeper or wiser. That was the way I learned it when Margot and I were at the goddess thing. By the time we came back, we were singing Stronger Than Before over and over and over again. And that young woman became one of the biggest chanters after that. I mean, she always was asking for songs and just really got enthusiastic about it. So that was a really nice thing. But, I stayed connected with Margot. For a long time, I stayed connected with Catherine Allport. And Sally Roche Wagner. I would never know Sally without that. I mean, that's where I met Sally, and Sally was a really important person in my life. Yeah. Well, there's a few women that I know that I know in UU circles that were part of it, and we've oftentimes run in it, talked about it, and reminisced about it, about how important it was. Cindy Sangre, I've run into her a few times. And
Did you know Grace Ross?
oh, Grace Ross, yeah. But Grace wasn't there at the beginning.
No.
I can't remember where I met Grace, but it might have been at a regional meeting or because of what was going on with the peace camp. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So even sometimes connections with people who were not, I might not have become friends with them and then continued, but the peace camp connection is always important. Well, I stayed with a lot of people because I was from the time I got to the peace camp until the time I started seminary in the fall of '84, I had no regular home. I lived in and out of my van, or I stayed with people. And so a lot of the people I stayed with in that year were people who were part of the peace camp. Helene Alon, the woman who did this poster, she's also the one that did the pillowcase project. Sonia Johnson I stayed connected with. I had met Sonia before, though. In fact, I just saw Sonia a few months ago.
Yeah.
And she also has some wonderful commentary on what's happened with the feminist movement. And they did this feminist hullabaloo thing where they got a lot of the old feminist leaders together and thinkers. And
Can you talk a little bit about what's going on as far as the feminist movement in now versus then?
well, Margot Adler recently redid her book, Drawing Down the Moon. It's like the 20th or 25th anniversary of the original book. This is a book about the neo-pagan movement in America. And I heard her give a talk last year in Andover, just up the road here. And one of her comments was that one of the big differences between when she first did the book and this most recent revision was basically the disappearance of the feminist movement. My big project right now is working on an international convocation of Unitarian Universalist women for 2009, February 2009. And it's one of the questions that we're asking ourselves is, what does it mean to be a woman in the 21st century? Where is feminism? Is it even relevant anymore? But it does. I don't really know. I mean, I think it's relevant. I think it's still, all the issues are still very live, and the threats against Roe v. Wade. There's a lot of stuff. And then if you look at women worldwide, the issues that have to do with women you can't deal with poverty without dealing with women. I've done a lot of work around microcredit, microfinance, and it's basically about empowering women economically. So there's, I think it's a huge issue. And that's why the feminist hullabaloo was a gathering of some of the the old feminists getting together and trying to figure out just that question. And for them, it was very much alive. That for them it's still very much alive. But what does it mean to younger women today? But then there's people like Jennifer Baumgarten who wrote Manifesta, which is really the articulation of third wave feminism. And we're hoping to have her at the conference. So there really is a sense that there is such a thing as third wave feminism. But I think what the peace camp represented was in some ways the penultimate of second wave feminism. It really was, it was from the 70s to the 90s, was this really strong wave of growing awareness, consciousness raising. And after the 90s, it kind of, it seemed like a lot of the achievements were made, but not really. But it seemed like it. And there wasn't anything really galvanizing women to articulate or to but I mean, if you look, there actually are some magazines that are that are third wave feminist magazines. But third wave feminism means something very different. And one of the things that's a little scary about third wave feminism is sometimes it basically means whatever anyone wants it to mean. So I got in an argument about this actually at one point, because I said something in a workshop. I said, what is this stuff about women shaving all their pubic hair off? Because in some high schools, everyone is doing that, boys and girls. And I said, that's it's infantilizing women, and this woman got really mad, and she said, if I want to shave off all my hair, that's my business, and if that's how I interpret being a woman, then that's my business, and I have a right to do that. And I wasn't saying she didn't have a right to do it, but I was saying, what does this mean on a symbolic level? It doesn't seem healthy to me. But she felt that I was being too judgmental, and that's a lot of what third wave feminism is about. Is saying however a woman interprets being a woman is feminist. I don't think that was I think there was a lot of empowerment of individual women in their lives because of their experiences. Now, as it turned out, I did not do a lot of physical labor at the camp, but for some women, that was a really primary thing. There were women who had never used a hammer before, never used an never used a saw, never built anything, and in fact, that was an interesting thing, because at one point this was probably later on, there was some discussion about, well, maybe we should let men in, and we're dwindling in numbers. Maybe we should really actually have workshops that included men and let them back on the property. And I remember it was the straight women who said absolutely no. That said, I would never have done the things that I did if men had been there, because I'd been around men all my life, and I never wanted to try, because I knew I wouldn't do it well enough. And so for me, for them, it was extremely important that men not be present, so that they would actually find those sources of empowerment within themselves and learn how to do these things. That was an issue, and sometimes it was an issue around that whole Waterloo thing about who could speak for the camp and who couldn't. And when the guys stopped the women on their perfectly legal march across the bridge in Waterloo, and I remember that was part of the affinity group idea, was that if the affinity group could meet and appoint a spokesperson who could then speak for that affinity group, and those spokespeople were supposed to get together, and then they were supposed to come up with decisions, and that was a sort of decentralized way to quickly make decisions in that kind of a tense environment. And I think to some extent that worked in that particular thing, although I was not functioning as part of an affinity group, so I was playing roving reporter at that point and going around and just interviewing a lot of people. I arrived right after the women got there. I heard something was going on. I jumped in my van and drove up, and I was there right after it. I can't remember exactly at what point I got there, but I wasn't in the march. They were just sitting down at that point.
So tell us what that was like for you.
It was fascinating. It was fascinating, but I pretended I wasn't with the peace camp so that I talked to everybody. I went around with a little flip pad, and I was going around and talking to people and interviewing people, and they probably knew I was from the peace camp, but I wasn't identifying myself in that way. I was just trying to get different viewpoints about what was going on.
And do you remember any of the comments that people were making at the time?
Well, I think there was mostly a lot of confusion. And then I remember talking to a couple of men who were like so angry with these women, and I was trying to get out of them, why were they so angry at these women? And and they were very angry that these women were lesbians, and I pointed out to them that they were not all lesbians, but even if they were, why should that bother them? And they were really fumbling around for why, but they were just, fuming. And I finally said something that was, clearly not being a reporter. I says, "Are you just worried that there aren't going to be any women to love you?" And that kind of stopped him. They didn't say much to me after that. A lot of the bystanders were siding with the women. There were some women who were kind of just watching the parade. I guess it was probably mostly women, and they weren't necessarily in favor of these guys. I mean, some of the guys, they knew the guys were troublemakers, and they'd been drinking, and they weren't like, supporting them necessarily. They were just, kind of watching what was going on.
Were you scared?
I wasn't particularly scared, but then I didn't scare easy in those days. So I was there when they had the trial. Well, what do I remember? I just remember this great big sort of Quonset hut kind of a place that it was pretty hot, and but I remember the women's statements, getting up and making these different statements, and at least a couple of the writings that I had were from that, because that Nazi Germany theme came up a lot in their statements as well. There were some really articulate things said then. Well, for me, as a relatively new lesbian, it was great. But there was, I don't know, maybe there, I don't think there was much tension between lesbians and non-lesbians. It doesn't. I mean, it was more like the community outside called us lesies, and we had a couple of songs that were pretty funny about that. So I think there were some discussions, I don't really remember specifically, but about, the politics of sexuality, and I'm sure that was a topic that got discussed in various workshops. But there were plenty of straight women that were there, and they're, like a lot of the women of faith that came were probably not lesbians. Some of them were Catholic nuns, so they may or may not have been lesbians, but there was a big thing about public displays of affection, PDAs, and there were some people some women who were very like, please, when you go out in public, don't do this because it's just gives a bad name to the camp, and other women for whom it was that in-your-face kind of stuff was very important. It was political to them, because while there were showers at the camp, they weren't very adequate showers, so a lot of women went to. They were just those solar heated things, so they went to the state park to take showers, and that was where certain things happened sometimes.
Do you have any memories of interactions with soldiers at the gate or any military personnel?
Singing to them, talking with them sometimes. Mostly we didn't talk to them too much, though, I don't think. But they did like our singing. They liked our singing, and they liked our, they particularly liked certain songs, like Listen, Listen, Listen to My Heart song. I will never, you remember that one? Do you know that song? Yeah, I Will Never Forget You. They liked that. They specifically asked for that song.
Did you fall in love at the camp?
Nope. I did have a couple of lovers when I was there, but not really much. I didn't do much of that.
Yeah.
For one thing, I was in a van, and I was up in the front, and I did not spend much time in the back because I couldn't take my van back there, and I slept in my van. Uh-huh. So to some extent, I might have been a little bit isolated.
Were you a part of the discussion at the end of summer of '83 about whether or not the camp should continue?
I don't remember much about that. I remember one time I blocked consensus, though. Yeah. That had to do with racism. There was something, it was a brochure that had been printed, and there were lots of them had been printed, and there was something on it that some of the women of color considered racist. And I don't remember if it was the second, it must have been the first year. I kind of think it was the first year. And a lot of people were saying, well, we can't afford to print it, to reprint it. And I said, but you have to. It's not right. And I ended up blocking consensus, and everybody was mad at me, I think. I wish I remembered what the brochure was exactly and what it said and everything, but there were a series of meetings about it, and I remember that I ended up standing up alone and saying, okay, they said, well, we're going to go ahead and do it unless somebody blocks consensus. So I said, okay, I'm going to block consensus. Only time in my life I ever did that. Yeah. But back to the thing about spokespeople, there was a thing about who could talk to there were some attempts made sometimes for not just anybody to talk to the press. There was attempts by there were leaders, they may have thought, people may think there were no leaders, but there were leaders that kind of ran things. Michelle being one of them. Although I found out when I interviewed her that she was really at one point she was the only staff person. She was actually the hired staff person at the beginning.
Yeah,
but there were certain people that were sort of who seemed to be the ones that they wanted to be the only ones to talk to the press. And I was trying to remember, somebody wrote a book about the peace camp, and it had something in it about me that I thought was totally wrong. And it had something to do with something I supposedly said to the press.
Nuclear summer?
Yeah, it must have been in that. And whatever it was she said about me, I thought was completely wrong. Something that I had supposedly said to the press that was seen as inflammatory or something like that. I don't think there was much discussion of it, but that sure was what I was encountering there. Yeah, definitely. But I think there was some classism because a lot of the women who really kind of, I think, put up the money and formed the original network, they kind of came from more, privileged backgrounds. I remember when Mary Hilton came to the camp, and she was a townsperson who came to the camp she came on a dare from the guys in the bar who, because they were saying it was all lesbians, and she said, well, she was going to go check it out. Well, she later became a lesbian and became a campy. But she was a townie, and she was obviously working class, and she didn't really fit in necessarily there was this kind of, there were the more educated, more, upper middle class type women who I remember, in thinking about class later on, the peace camp is not one of my sources of where we discussed anything like that. Well, it was interesting because he was 8 years old. He had just turned 8, and in order for me to stay there for the whole summer, I had to have him there for a month, and so there were a lot of women who were very because he didn't come, I don't think, until August. Or until late July, August. And there were a lot of women who were very concerned about his coming, that it was going to be really too weird. Even though it was allowed, prepubescent boys were allowed, they were very concerned that it was going to be a bad situation, and they were afraid. And there was a fair amount of discussion, not like in a big meeting kind of discussion, but, just amongst the people, but amongst women. And then when he came, they liked him a lot. He was a really sweet kid, and he was really very friendly and very basically kind of a gentle boy. So he fit in just fine, and it was wonderful for me because it was like the fantasy. Like, I didn't have to worry about him. He would go off to the back lot, and I wouldn't see him for hours and hours and hours, but I knew someone was taking care of him. It was like that culture that you imagine living in, where everybody takes care of everybody's kids, and so I think he had a good time. We haven't really talked about it much.
Oh. Other than Listen, Listen, Listen to My Heart song, what was your favorite Peace Camp song?
Oh boy! Well, I really loved that one. That was another issue, though. But one of my favorite songs is one of the songs that was an issue because it's like a Confederate tune, the one about we're shameless hussies and we don't give a damn, because it's to that what is the song? Dixie. It's to the tune of Dixie.
Yeah.
I loved a lot of them. I mean, I made song sheets I collected songs and I taught songs, and so it's hard to say a favorite one. And I remember, and I like that. We'll keep on moving forward, keep on moving. That's a Pat Humphries song, I think. Never turning back. And then there's a bunch of them. It's hard to say because I like so many of them.